this is John Sadak, TV voice of the Cincinnati Reds, and you're up for Late Night Reds Talk.
What is going on, everybody? It is Monday night, and you know what that means. Another fantastic edition of Late Night Reds Talk Live, brought to you by Believe and Bet Online. Bet Online is back and better than ever with our new web interface for the start of basketball season and more props and odds than better before. Bet Online remains your number one spot for all basketball football action this season. Head to the new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code BELIEVE50 to receive your bonus. That's BLEAV 50. And now on to Late Night Reds Talk Live. We are without Carlos tonight. He is celebrating his anniversary, but never fear, the crew is here. I am Tim Daniel, as always, with Mr. Nick Kirby. How are you, sir?
What is going on? Wanted to shout out everyone who joined our emergency podcast on Friday night. Really great crowd joined us. I was super excited about that. Thanks for all your interactions and everything. And we'll probably try to do that again if everyone seemed to like it. You know, as there's breaking news throughout the off season, I'm sure there will be some here and there. So thanks again to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I was working a basketball game that night, so I couldn't make it. But I appreciate you guys holding it down, you and Clay. That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Clay. Thanks, Clay, for coming on last minute.
Absolutely, yeah. We are really excited for our guest today. He currently has a book out that he tells us before is selling very well and very happy to hear. He is the author of Joe Nuxoff, The Old Lefthahder Me. He is a media beat blogger for WVXU.org. He's been in the Cincinnati media field for quite a while. Our good friend, and hopefully yours, Mr. John Kiesewtter. Welcome to Late Night Reds Talk Live.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
How are you, man? You doing all right?
Well, I survived last week. I mean, the news of losing 3 Reds players in the span of 4 days was pretty tough.
It's life around here, I guess it seems like at times, but you know, we're here to roll with the punches and hope for the positives. That's what we do here because we got nothing else to do apparently. John, obviously you've talked quite a bit. You read your biographies, you've been around the Reds, you've been a Reds fan for a long time. And I noticed when I was looking into some information on you, you said the year you became a Reds fan was 1961.
1961, I was 8 years old when the Reds were in the pennant race and won the National League pennant and went to play the World Series with the New York Yankees. That was really when I became a really big Reds fan. Back in that day, there was only like 47 games or about that many on TV. So it wasn't a full 162 like Reds fans have now. So we did an awful lot of radio listening. But as an 8-year-old, to have your favorite team, the Reds, go to the World Series, it was just the greatest, man.
So for those who aren't like us, the baseball geeks, the 1961 Reds in the World Series, yes, like John mentioned, they played the New York Yankees, who at the time had the greatest home run hitting duo in history at that time in Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle. That's obviously the infamous year where Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle are chasing the infamous 60 home run record that they put an asterisk next to, which is still hilarious to me that they just were that protective. But obviously that's a pretty incredible year to first get involved with the ball club. And it got, you saw go to the World Series at 8. So that means you were a teenager when they went in 70. Right. So you've obviously seen some good baseball in your time.
I was lucky. I graduated from Ohio University in 1975 with a journalism degree. And the only gig I could get was a summer internship for 13 weeks with the Cincinnati Enquirer right out of college. And it got near the end of August, early September, and I was a graduated senior. And the city editor said, well, if you don't look for a job, we could hang you on here and keep you on because it looks like the Reds might go to the World Series. We're going to need some extra reporters. So my job in the World Series and the playoffs of 75 was to what we called the local color. The reporter that went down and talked to fans or talked to longtime fans who are in for their X number of consecutive World Series and see about 2 innings of the game and then have to run back to the Enquirer and write a story for the next day's paper. So I didn't get to see a whole lot of the game, but I was part of the World Series coverage team. And that was a nice way to start a career.
That's so, yeah. So for those like you and I, how we're talking here. So I I cover all the local Division I basketball teams,
Mhm.
credentialed to cover them. And my first year I got on the beat for Xavier was Chris's last year when they were the 1 seed. And I grew up a Xavier fan. So like you understand that like when you're there and you're watching, you have to like just have no emotion, but inside you're like, yes, like
And you know, and it's a great gig. My gig was to go out and talk to fans who love the Reds, and come back and write stories about them. Um, the one unfortunate part was, you know, I would have loved to have been able to hang out in the stadium all 9 innings and see the game, but with a press pass, I was just interviewing different people or interviewing back at that point out on the plaza outside Riverfront Stadium, and then have to come back and write something. But it was really exciting. And then, you know, we had it 75, 76, and we thought, boy, this is the way life is always going to be. And then it took a while till 1990. And then, you know, the great drought since then.
So John, I followed you for a long time. Certainly enjoy like your coverage. Kind of definitely nerd out in some of like the media. I love to look up like TV ratings. That stuff kind of just always fascinated me. For me, I'm someone who the Reds went to cable exclusive like when I was in high school. So I'm really interested and fascinated about what life was like with the Reds pre, you know, even 145 games a year on cable before they went to every game. I know I remember watching some games, you know, when I was young on like Channel 64. I've seen some old clips where Marty Brenneman was actually
He was part of the team.
doing play-by-play on TV. Tell me about life pre-cable and how the Reds were covered and how they moved out primetime programming and how all that worked.
It was a wholly different universe back, I would say, through the 60s and the 70s and well into the mid 90s. WLWT Channel 5, NBC station, was the flagship of the Reds TV network, and they only did, I think, 47 games a year, and it was 44 road games and 3 home games. One was opening day, and the other 2 they couldn't announce till like 24 or 48 hours in advance because the Reds feared that it would hurt the gate, that if people knew they could sit at home watch it on TV, they wouldn't drive down to the ballpark and go to the game. So one of the reasons that Marty and Joe, or that baseball on the radio has always been so hugely popular here, is because, you know, to get all the games, you had to go to radio, and you only had like 47 games a year that you could actually watch them on TV. One byproduct of all that was that in the 70s, when the Reds were so good, they were on Channel 5. And so when NBC came in to do their game of the week, because that was pre-cable also meant pre-ESPN. So if you were a national baseball fan, you had the NBC's game of the week on Saturday. And in the 80s, you had ABC experimented with Monday Night Baseball like they do Monday Night Football. But because Channel 5 did, and they were an NBC affiliate, did the Reds games, when NBC would come in, they'd pick up all the people from Channel 5 who could cover a game very well. I mean, they had a guy in center field who could zoom in on the pitcher delivering the pitch, and then he could open the camera and follow the ball, you know, like a line drive back up to center field, unlike anybody that NBC had. So they always had great camera work when NBC would come to town, but it was a wholly different universe until the mid 90s when they switched to a cable package. And here's the other thing that was crazy about it. Because they were an NBC affiliate, Channel 5 and NBC would have this dance each year because in May sweeps, Channel 5 wanted to get as many Reds games in there because they were big ratings, and big ratings meant big revenues. But there were times that NBC would do like a 2-part miniseries back when they did movies of the week, Sunday and Monday. And NBC didn't carry either of them because they had a Reds game Monday night and they blew off the network for the big 2-part NBC miniseries. So NBC, the network, was not happy with their Cincinnati affiliate blown off the network. And when NBC had the World Series at times, I guess this was in the, I'm trying to think, it must have been in the 80s, because on Thursday night, they would air Cosby at 8 o'clock and then start the baseball game at 8:30 instead of 8 o'clock, so they could have the Bill Cosby #1 show on TV wouldn't be interrupted by the World Series schedule.
That's fascinating. Was that were the Reds like competitive that time in terms of what other teams in their markets were doing? Like you said, 47 games, I think. Was that like a competitive rate, or was that more or less average?
You know, I'm going to have to say yes. I mean, the anomaly back then was the 2 cable superstations, which are WGN with the Cubs and TBS at Atlanta. Ted Turner would put all the cable, all the Braves games on cable. So if you're a baseball fan, you could watch those 2 and see those, you know, Harry Carey and doing games out of Chicago. But I'm pretty sure. And in Cleveland, they were on the independent station. Is it UAB, AUB, UAB? I think it is. So that in some markets, the baseball franchise would be on an independent, like WGN was an independent station, TBS was independent, not one of the big 3 network affiliates. But in Cincinnati, they had the NBC network. They had to juggle in and around the Reds broadcasts.
Was there something in 1995 where there was a potential of blacking out the playoff game in Cincinnati because they didn't sell out? Do I remember something about that?
Well, let's see. I was at those games, so
that was after the strike.
Right, and that was Marge hosted. It was the Reds Braves. Let's see, the Reds beat the Dodgers, and then they came here, and Marge didn't throw a party or anything like they usually did, and so when they went to Atlanta, the Braves ownership, which was probably Ted Turner at the time, went overboard and having these great lavish parties for the media and everything because Marge. The other thing I remember about 90, and I mentioned it in my book, Joe Nuxoff, the Old Left-Hander, was that 1990 playoff games, Marge's idea of pregame entertainment was having the Cincinnati police mounted horse patrol out in center field and do their horse formations. And of course, horses did what horses did. And the grounds crew had to come with like snow shovels to scrape up the crap off the field. And you could see these brown smears in the AstroTurf. And you just knew that Reggie Sanders wasn't going to go diving for no ball in the gap. But that was her idea of pregame entertainment.
That's interesting. That's all the nerd questions I got about the media. I appreciate it. I'm always fascinated about stuff like that.
Well, you know, I think, you know, Marty and Joe, and I had the great pleasure of covering Marty from 85 when I took over the beat till through his retirement, and Joe for the 21 years he was there that I was on the beat, and they were such a big deal here because they were on every day and they were entertaining, and actually Marty has said that, you know, in the early 80s, after they had the 100 loss season, and you know, Perez, Rose, Morgan, Foster, Seaver, Eastwick, McEnany, they were all gone. That he said we became better broadcasters because we became storytellers and entertainers, and people weren't tuning in to hear a 100-loss team, you know, whether they're going to win that night or not, but they tuned in to hear Marty and Joe just, you know, having fun on the radio.
I remember once listening to Marty do a game, and this was a few years back. And he was talking about WLW was contracted to do so many major league games. Like, so there was times when they would go to Milwaukee and do a Brewers game because they had to with their contract. Do you kind of remember that?
No, the way I remember it is that two things. Now the Reds have their own rights and produce their own show. But when WLW produced it as the flagship. Two things. That's why you had the banana phone, because you had WLW had this big 3-hour window that they had to sell. They had to have broadcast something so they could put commercials around it so they could make money. Now the Reds don't need a banana phone. If it's raining, they just go back, throw it back to the network stations and let them fill the time and just occasionally jump in. But they, when the WLW had the contract, they would go to the banana phone because they had programming that they had to sell, whether it was a ball game or not. And if it's not, it's going to be the banana phone. The other thing was during the strike of '94, because WLW had this time allotted and advertising sold for programming, that during the strike they sent Marty and Joe to Birmingham, Alabama, to do a AA game over the weekend, a series over the weekend, when the Reds, the AA Chattanooga Lookouts, played the Birmingham Barons. And that was significant because that was the year Michael Jordan was playing outfield for the Birmingham Barons. And I have it one of the pregame shows during that weekend of a game that nobody really cared about except Jordan was playing. Joe did a pregame interview with Michael Jordan about the difficulty in transitioning from basketball to baseball and what it was like picking up baseball, 14, 15 years whenever he played it in high school. And so the WLW needed to do that, to have programming at least on the weekend, because they had this pre-sold advertising package for the season. But it made for some funny stories that actually while they were down there, Marty and Joe and Dave Yiddy Armbruster went to the old original ballpark that's still there. It's now a historic landmark, where Joe had pitched in 1944 when he pitched for the Reds in 44, and he got bombed by the Cardinals. They actually sent him at age 15 to Birmingham, Alabama, to pitch for the Birmingham Barons, which were a Reds minor league farm team. And he only pitched once, and he got lit up just as bad as he did against the Cardinals. So I've got it in the book, his combined stats were, I think he pitched an inning and 2/3, and it was kind of the similar result. He gave up, I think, 6 runs, 5 hits, 4 walks or something. It was just an ugly line, and they never pitched him again.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that story about.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Marty covering Michael Jordan.
It was. Yeah, I was able to track down the entire interview, and in my chapter on his Star of the Game and pregame interviews, I have some excerpts of that, and also, I mean, that was the back when Joe did interviews, and after a while, most of the players or the coaches he knew were out of the game, and players stood him up, and he couldn't get players. But the last weekend that Ozzie Smith, when he was retiring, which I think was in '96, the Reds were playing the Cardinals that final weekend when the retirement weekend for Ozzie Smith, and he had Ozzie Smith on and talked about Ozzie Smith and the history of doing the backflip and Smith at the end of the interview, when Joe wished him well, said he really enjoyed when he'd be coming to Cincinnati and have to play against the Big Red Machine, because they're always such a tough team, and knew that it would be always a tough time and to compete against the great athletes that Cincinnati had with the Reds.
I think one of my all-time favorite Marty and Joe moments, and it's so funny, I just watched a documentary recently and this popped up on it, was, I think it was like 88 or 89. There was one time in the booth, they had Macho Man Randy Savage in the booth. And the story of like the Marty talks about it is the game's going on, but everyone in the ballpark is looking up at the radio booth because Randy Savage is in there and he's in full Macho Man gear.
Right. He had a thing at Riverfront Coliseum that night. Yes, he did. And there was a poster of Hulk Hogan on the wall in the booth, and he took it and he shredded it.
I didn't know that part.
Yeah. And Eric Davis and some of the players popped out of the dugout and were flexing to show their muscles to Randy. Randy was a
Former Red.
It was a Reds farmhand, a catcher in the early 70s that kind of washed out and went into wrestling. Well, then, that made a good story in the book, because after all this went on, everybody was enjoying it, because in that game, both starting pitchers, the Red starter and the Padres starter, didn't last the first inning. It was like 7-6 after the first inning. I mean, it was an awful game. So having this diversion up in the radio booth was entertaining for the fans rather than watching this awful ball game. But after about the fourth or fifth innings, Steve Schott, who was the nephew of Marge Schott's late husband, came into the booth and told Yid to get him off the air, get Macho Man off the air. And Marty overheard it and was not pleased, and told Joe to take over the broadcast. And he went out and confronted Steve Schott in the hallway and basically said, you don't come in our booth, you don't tell us what to do. So then after the game, I think it was Jim Ferguson said, Marge would like to see you in her office. So after the game, they all go down to Marge's office, and there's Yid and Marty and Joe and Steve Schott and Marge, and Marge was trying to say that, this wasn't the proper entertainment for the ballpark, and Marty said, look, I go over there, it's great fun, people of all ages love it. I take my daughter there, which he did, and at one point Steve said, I almost had to get physical with him, meaning Macho Man. to which Marge told her nephew to just shut up. And so anyway, the people saw the theatrics going on in the booth with Macho Man that day, but the real match came after the game in Marge's office, and Marty won them both.
That's like an all-time Reds photo. I need to put that up in my basement. I'm sure my wife will be cool with that. So we do want to get into real quick, obviously, the reason you're here is your book. Right. And obviously, the idea of the book is pretty self-explanatory. You were around Joe for a very long time. You got to know him fairly well. And you interviewed him quite a bit, obviously, and the book is kind of telling the story of your time interviewing him. It's not like a Linda Tripp thing where you're hiding tapes, emails. You're actually literally have it with him, so he knows that you guys are talking. So kind of tell us a little bit about how this came together.
Well, when I left the Enquirer at the end of 2014, I knew I was going to write a book of some sort, and kind of kicked around on different things. And for one concept, I was writing this chapter about Marty and Joe and realized I had an awful lot of material about Joe that a lot of people didn't know or was relevant and interesting. What happened is I grew up in Middletown, and like we talked, I was a Reds fan and 8 years old in 1961. And in 1962, the Reds have a winning record, and they're 10 games out in July behind the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Pirates. And they bring up this left-handed pitcher from the minors named Joe Nuxhall from Hamilton. He's left-handed, I'm left-handed. And Nuxhall goes 5-0. And I thought he was some young stud pitcher like O'Toole and Maloney and other guys from the farm system. And my dad said, no. Let me tell you about Joe Nuxhall. He pitched in 1944 during the war, 15 years old, the youngest player ever. Pitched through the 50s, was an all-star in 55 and 56, and then went 1-8 in 60, and they traded him away to Kansas City. And so he missed the 61 season, which was the World Series season. And right then I found my hero. And in fact, I had an old Topps card. I don't know if you can see this at all, but I actually,
wow.
And I framed it. And I tell people it's on my dresser, except it's in my hand right now. But it's still on my dresser today, just a remnant from my childhood. So it was a big deal when I would be able to interview him for like 20 years. But we moved up here to Fairfield in 1986, where he lived, and he would come to my church, to the KSC, in January, and talk about the Reds and the Reds prospects for this year. And then somebody would say, Joe, tell us about the old days. And he would talk for like an hour and a half, just telling hilarious story after hilarious stories about his playing days, about Kozuski, about a spitball duel between Gaylord Perry and Jim Maloney. He'd tell there's a time in Wrigley Field after a rain delay that the Cubs bunted on him, and he went to field it and fell on his ass. And so the next guy up bunted on him, and he fell on his ass again. And then Ernie Banks doubled, and another guy singled, and Bertie Tebbetts came out to relieve him, and he was so pissed that he tried to tear up his glove. He threw it in the stands. He threw bats. He threw helmets, and then he went into the clubhouse. And back then, the helmets were in a box that were about 6 feet long and about a foot square that they stacked the helmets in. And he kicked it, and it got stuck to his foot. And he's walking around the clubhouse with this big, giant box on his foot. And the clubhouse boys had to get it off of him. So he told these just really hilarious stories. So without notes for like an hour and a half. And they go until either somebody would raise their hand and say, one last question, or more than likely somebody raise their hand and say, we're out of beer. The meeting's over. And so when Joe wrote his own book with Greg Horde in 2004, none of those great stories were in it. And when I would interview Joe, about whatever story I was doing for the Enquirer or whatever, then I'd take time at the end and say, hey, tell me about the time of you fell on your butt fielding the bunts in Wrigley, or tell me about the spitball duel, or tell me about Kozuski or Kurt Flood or Billy Martin, or all the people that or throwing a spitter himself. So I had all these stories, and I thought, okay, let's put it together in a book. And actually, the first chapter is all the great stories that I would hear him tell when he did speaking appearances. And then I did a chapter on Joe's transition to broadcasting and working with Al Michaels and Marty and Marty and Joe and the pranks they played on each other. I even did a chapter on him hitting. He hit like 15 home runs. That's one more than Bob Uecker, if anybody cares. And even did a chapter on the Kroger commercials that he did, and the star of the game, and pitching batting practice. I mean, that was the other thing. If you back in the old days, you could get to Riverfront Stadium. You got there early. You could watch the Reds take batting practice, and Joe would be pitching. And what sets him apart, you think of all the baseball games you've watched, and often the analyst is a former pitcher. Oral Hershiser, Bob Gibson, Jim Palmer, Ron Darling, C.J. Nikowski, Welsh, Brantley, and even all the way going back to Dizzy Dean, pitchers have been analysts, but nobody pitched batting practice, and he did almost every day. He retired during spring training in April of '67, and the very next day he pitched batting practice, and he pitched batting practice from '67 till after Rose came back in '84. It was roughly about '87 when finally Marge interceded and he stopped pitching batting practice. But he had like 20 years of pitching batting practice and people like Foster and Bench say that he was a big asset to the Big Red Machine to have when they're going to face Randy Jones or Steve Carlton or a lefty, that they could take batting practice from a lefty. It wasn't the same speed, but they could get the motion of the ball, of the delivery, and set up their timing a bit. And both Foster and Bench said he was just a really big asset to the team during the Big Red Machine years.
It's pretty wild to have a radio broadcaster out throwing batting practice, whereas take it to 2021, we're doing Zoom calls. Like, think of how far we've gone from covering, the game. That's such a crazy. I'm sure that helped, Nuxhall with his ability to relate to the players, to tell their stories on the air, being, down there on the field every day with them.
Well, and he always considered himself part of the team. his whole thing, when somebody would hit a home run and he'd start shouting, get out of here, get out of here. That's what he did, and other guys on the bench as a player in the 50s and the 60s, that the ball would get out. But he started his day in the clubhouse, and he ended his day in the clubhouse after doing the star of the game. He often ate lunch or ate his pregame meal down in the clubhouse, back when they had pregame meals, rather than come up and have it in the media dining room with Marty and Yid and all. He was a batting practice pitcher. He was a coach. He was a mentor. He was just one of the guys, and he was just he touched the club in so many different ways, and the fans. It was just, and the other thing that Mark and Rick Stowe pointed out, he and Bernie Stowe, the old equipment manager, were the only two who had a locker in Riverfront Stadium every year. That players came and went, but Bernie and Joe always had a locker. And even in the fall call-ups, when they'd add players to the, bring up players from the AAA roster, Joe still got a locker to himself, like he was pitching batting practice. And when he was on the road, most of the clubhouse boys knew him from his playing days or knew that he pitched batting practice. And he had a locker in all the other National League stadiums around the league, so he could pitch batting practice before he did a game.
That's so crazy. I never knew that.
It's a totally different era that, and the post game star of the game. Tom Browning said that after he threw the perfect game, he was greeted down in the edge of the dugout where Joe did his show, and Joe had 2 beers in his hand, one for Tom and one for himself, and they drank a beer and did the star of the game show.
That's awesome.
The thing about Joe is he was such a great storyteller, and the one chapter I've got in there is I actually sat him down once and asked him to give me his all-time Reds lineup, position by position, and I asked the same question to Marty, and I won't give it away, but I mean, you think of the first baseman, he played with Clue, he played with Lee May, he played with Tony Perez, and then he watched Sean Casey. In shortstops, he was pitching batting practice when the day Larkin did his tryout, when Larkin was at the University of Michigan and came down to Riverfront. But before Larkin there was Concepcion, and before Concepcion there was Cardenas and Roy McMillan, and he played with those 3. I guess only 2 of the 3, because Concepcion came in 1970 after Joe had retired. But when Joe was still, Johnny Bench reminded me that Bench came up in 67, was Rookie of the Year in 68. But in 66, he was there as a catcher, and he caught Joe in spring training before Joe's last season in 66. And, Joe saw the beginning of the Big Red Machine when he played in the 60s, when Perez came up and Rose came up and Bench came up, Tommy Helms, who was later traded for Morgan. So he saw the beginnings of the machine, and then broadcast all the games, of course, in the 70s.
You're muted, Nick.
So can I answer the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So who is my favorite player besides? Boy, that's a good question. I really like Tom Browning, only because he was such a no-nonsense left-handed pitcher. I really liked Larkin, and Larkin, his MVP season. And I told my kids, who were born between in the 80s and the early 90s, I said, if Larkin ever goes to the Hall of Fame, we're going to go. And in 2012, we made a road trip, and my 3 sons and I drove up to Cooperstown and watched the enshrinement ceremony, and that was great fun. Trying to think of some of the other players. I'd like to watch Pete Rose and Joe Morgan, as much for their their speed on the base pass and daringness to take a base, and their ability as well as Bench and Perez to come through in the clutch. I was there the day that Rose came back as player manager in '84, and they were playing the buzz went through the Enquirer where I was working that the Reds had acquired Rose, and then the next day it was, he's put himself in the lineup. He's going to hit leadoff, because there was a question. He wasn't hitting that well for Montreal when we acquired him, and whether he was going to how much he'd play. And then that day that I went to the game that night, and they actually held up the first pitch for about 20 minutes because there was such a huge walk-up crowd. They ran out of scorecards. Some of the people that arrived late couldn't get a scorecard. And then Rose gets up, and the first shot he hits it up the middle, and it got past Dernier, and he took third base, and he goes into third base head first, and like the whole place just exploded. It was an amazing scene that day. And when Morgan came up with guys on, when he came on, when he got on base, you always would figure he was going to steal. He added such a dimension. And that leads to a story of the book. I did a whole chapter about the pranks that Marty and Joe played on each other in the booth. And one that Marty and Joe talked about for years was there was a game in Candlestick Park. And in Candlestick, the engineer for the visiting radio team was Mike Marquardt, was quite a practical joker. And one time he rewired the speaker in the Reds booth, the speaker that they make the announcements, the time of the game or the weather conditions or substitutions. So it could only be heard in the booth. And in the first inning, there's a page for Joe Nuxhall to come to the press box for a long distance call. And Joe's kind of pissed because everybody who knows what he does knows that he's in Candlestick calling a Reds game. Why would somebody be calling him? So he goes down to the press box and says, "Where's the long distance call?" Nobody knows what he's talking about, of course. So he goes back to the booth in the second inning. The long distance call for Joe Nuxhall, please come to the press box. So he goes down there again, and the guys look like he's got three eyes or something. They have no idea what he's talking about. So he comes back, and it happens in the third inning. It happens in the fourth inning. In the fifth inning, in Marty's words, in the fifth inning when this announcement came over, he went down there to kill somebody. He was that man. Another time they get to San Francisco, and the engineer has, so this is 1977, and brought in a VHS machine. And at that time, they were as big as a suitcase or as big as like a dresser drawer. And he hid it under his feet where the engineer sat, and he wired it to the TV monitor in the booth. So in the seventh inning, it's Joe's inning, and he's calling the game, and Morgan gets on first. He steals second and is called out, and immediately pops up and starts to argue. And Sparky Anderson runs out to second base, and they continuing the argument. And Joe looks down for the replay on the TV, and the engineer hit play, and instead of the replay, up popped Deep Throat, the X-rated movie. and Joe is thinking that Deep Throat is going out to the entire Reds TV network, and he's there giving Marty the elbow and pointing to the booth. And of course, it's radio. He's not saying anything. He's speechless because of what he's seeing, and they got him real good. There was another time that another story I wrote about in 1997. Sports Illustrated actually did a 2-page story on Joe Nuxhall about the fact that he was, I think at that point, 58 years old and still pitching batting practice for the Reds. And and it talked about how he was throwing more pitches in batting practice than he ever did during his career, and in one day. And so there's this nice story about Joe. The Sports Illustrated writer spent the weekend with him in the radio booth in Shea Stadium one weekend. And the story comes out, and Dick Wagner, the Reds president, is just pissed. He's just royally pissed because Joe said that after a game, he likes to go home and unwind. He watches Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. He eats a pound of Colby cheese, and he drinks a 6-pack of Michelob every night. And Dick Wagner calls him in and says, "Don't you know that our sponsor is Stroh's, not Michelob?" But on the jump page, there was one sentence that got Marty in trouble, because the writer noted that when Joe was calling his innings, Marty would sit in the booth and read a novel. He'd have the headphones on so he could listen, but he wasn't watching the game. He was listening to Joe, but he was a big reader. He still is. He would always have a novel that he read on the bus to the ballpark and on the way back. And when Joe did his innings, he'd relax and read a novel. So Marty gets a call from Dick Wagner's secretary to come to the ballpark early the next day. And Marty comes in and he goes in Wagner's office, big wood desk, and he's got the Sports Illustrated open on his desk. And Dick goes, "Did you see this?" And Marty said, "Yes." He goes, "Is this true?" And Marty said, "Yes." He said, usually he and Wagner would have these big knockdown, drag down arguments, but this time he knew that Dick Wagner had him, and he just sat there and quietly took his medicine from Wagner, saying that this was the most unprofessional thing he's ever heard of, to be reading a novel while the ball game's going on when you're supposed to be at work. And if I ever hear of it again, your career's over. Don't ever do it again. So on a road trip about a week later, they go into Montreal, and Nuxhall conspires with the engineer for the visiting radio team. He said, "Look, when I lean back in my chair and put my hands behind my head, I want you to cut the microphones and then cue Marty to come back that the commercial's over, but it'll be about 30 seconds before the commercial break is actually over." So after in the middle of after the end of the second, going into the third, which would be Joe's inning, Joe leans back and puts his hands behind his head. And so the engineer cues Marty early, and Marty says, "Welcome back to Montreal. And now for the third inning, here's the old left-hander, Joe Nuxoff." And Joe leans into the microphone and looks over and says, "Hey, Marty, what book you're reading today?" And Marty said he saw his whole career flash in front of him, and he called Joe every name of the book. And Joe was just beaming that he got Marty. And he told me this story 20 years later, but he was that thrilled about having finally caught Marty on one. Because a lot of times Joe would be the butt of the joke. There was at one time when Marge Shot was on 60 Minutes, Marty would lean in and say, hey, Joe, did you see that last night? And Yid said, Joe just took his microphone and laid it down on the table. He wasn't going to say a word at all. He didn't want to comment or anything. Or he'd sometimes fold his arms over his chest and lean back. The one time the rock band Damn Yankees were playing a concert at Riverfront Coliseum, Old Riverfront Coliseum. So the band members came into the booth after the day game before, and Marty and the band are talking about the Damn Yankees, and Joe says, "Oh, Damn Yankees," says, I saw that on Broadway once. Just no clue about rock bands, referring to the Broadway musical instead. But they were just so much fun to listen to, and they had an awful lot of fun off the air, in addition to to calling the game and making the games fun.
John, curious about like the last few years. I believe Joe retired in 2004.
Right.
What was kind of the last few years of broadcasting like for him? Grim Griffey Jr. coming back. Was there any? Did the game become less joyful or anything for him at the end, or?
Well, there was a controversy when they announced in 2002 that he was going to be doing that he would retire at the end of the 2004 season, and for the 2004 season he was going to do 60 games because he had been with the Reds for 60 years. And that's when they hired a guy by the name of Steve Stewart, who didn't last long. He was there for 3 or 4 years with the Reds. He's now with the Kansas City Royals broadcast team. And in 2004, that summer, his book comes out, and he had a book signing at the public library downtown. And he made it clear that he didn't want to retire, but he was being forced out by the Reds, and that he wanted to cut back his schedule a little bit because the travel was getting to him, but it wasn't his idea. And at that point, John Allen was the GM, and Carl Lindner owns the team. And all he would say was it wasn't John Allen. And Kim Nuxhall, Joe's son, later told me that, to his dying day, he thought that Carl Lindner, for some reason, wanted to force him out and force him into retirement. As Kim said, he wanted to cut back on his schedule. He didn't want to do all 162. So that story is like front page of the Enquirer the next morning. It was all over TV, and the Reds went into full-time damage control and said there had been a misunderstanding and that Joe would be back for games with Marty, some games for Marty the next year. As it turned out, he did 40 or 50 games, I think, in 05. He did games in 06, and he did games in 07, and he died at the end of the 07 season. And Russ Jackson, who was one of the producers of Reds Radio, said that when he did games that last couple of seasons, when the game was over, he'd like to linger in the booth and just kind of sit there and look out on the field. And he in Russ Jackson's mind, it was Joe, just not wanting to leave, enjoying this seat, enjoying this perch in the ballpark, and, not knowing when it would end. When those last 2 or 3 years, he had different bouts with cancer, some lymph nodes in his legs, in his tonsils. It kind of came and went. They think they'd get it, and then they didn't. And Marty, when he retired in 2019, made it clear that he retired at age, I guess it was 78. But he was in good health, and he wanted to be able to travel. He wanted to be able to play golf and enjoy life. And he made the point of it. He said, by the time Joe retired, he was ill and had different problems with cancer, and that he couldn't really enjoy life. He couldn't travel. He couldn't do a lot of the things that people would want to do when they're finally freed of work, and to get out and to retire and travel. And he said that was one of the reasons. Actually, someone at the club had proposed. Marty stayed 46 years through the 2019 150th anniversary. But they had asked him if he'd stay for 50. And he said, no way. No, I want to get out. And he's enjoyed traveling and playing golf and not being tethered to the ballpark every night as he was when he was with the Reds doing the games.
So, John, you obviously, with all the work you've done with Joe, getting to know Joe, can you talk a little bit about the Joe Nuxoff Foundation, some of the work you may have done with them, and kind of like what we're planning to do with the book as well? And
yeah, I'm giving $1 of each book to the Nuxhall Foundation. And actually, when I signed a book to Kim, I said, hopefully someday I can give you a check for $1,000. When this is all over with through Christmas, it's going to be more than $2,000. I'm just thrilled. The Nuxhall Foundation has 2 or 3 different programs. The one that I find that's closest to my heart is that starting in '85, Joe began giving high school senior scholarships to go to college. And he passed in 2007, and they still do this. So that in 36 years, the Nuxhall Foundation has given nearly $900,000 to kids to go to college in the name of a guy that never went to college at all, not one day. But here in Butler County, there's 12 high schools that they support, and they either give $1,000 to 2 kids at each school, or they give $2,000 to 1 kid at the 12 schools. And each year they have a lunch, and they present the awards. And it's interesting they don't talk about the kids. They don't say he was, a 3-time letter in basketball and football or tennis or track. They instead talk about the the volunteer work that each kid does, whether it's at a daycare or nursing home or a food pantry or whatever. And it's just kind of neat. The other thing that the Joe Nuxoff Foundation has is the Miracle League fields up here in Fairfield. And the Miracle League are 2 side-by-side all-weather baseball fields for the developmentally disabled to play baseball. And they have devices so that if the kid is paralyzed, like from the neck down, he can blow on a tube and it'll swing a bat to hit a ball. And when each kid comes up to bat, both diamonds have a huge video screen. And when every kid that comes up to bat has his name announced and his name and face put on the video screen, just like a big league team. And there's some leagues that play there. And it's just not kids. There's kids from the age 4 to 74 who play a game that they probably, some of them thought they'd never be able to play, and a game that Joe loved. Unfortunately, the field opened in 2012, so it was after Joe passed. They've since added other things to the complex. They added, as a kid, I called it a merry-go-round. It was a round thing where you'd push it around and you hop on and it's right around. But they have one of those with locks and straps so you could lock down a wheelchair and spin a kid. And 2 years ago, they have opened a handicapped accessible 18-hole miniature golf course so that kids could play golf as well. And the next dream is building a gym building to the right next to it, where there could be a gym for year-round athletic facilities. Because as you know, whatever town you're in, the gym time for all the high school and grade school and YMCA and all the other teams, it's always at a premium to get gym space. So and golf was kind of neat too, because Joe was, loved to play golf. There's varying reports on how well he did. I run into people, and through having this book out, and they say, how nice Joe was, or they met him at a restaurant, or they saw him around the ballpark, and he gave him an autograph, and he was always so nice and friendly. And those that play golf with him, many of them have a story about playing golf with Joe and seeing him throw a club. There's some people that maybe saw him throw 2. Tom Browning in the book told me that he played with Joe once, and Joe threw every club in his bag. He threw a club and it got stuck in the moss in a tree down in Plant City, and he took every club he had, thrown it up there to try to knock it out. And he looked over to Browning, and Browning sitting in the golf cart drinking a beer, just laughing his ass off at Joe. And he said Joe came over, sat down, and opened up a beer. They each had a beer, and then Joe went back to where all his clubs are scattered, took one, threw it up, knocked the club loose, and it came down, put all the clubs back in his bag, and they continued playing golf.
That's awesome. So for other people who are looking to pick up a copy of this book after this interview you did with us today, where all can they pick one? Where all can they get a copy of the book?
They can get it. I have a website. As you look real close on the cover of that book, you see that that's me holding an old school cassette player. So my kids think it's hilarious that Analog Man here has a website and soon to have an ebook. But I have a website called tvkiese.com, tvkiese.com. I'm self-publishing, which means I'm sitting behind me here in the living room is a stack of 10 boxes. So I sign each book and mail it. You can also get it at amazon.com. If you're in the greater Cincinnati area, it's at Joseph Beth Booksellers over at Rookwood Commons. It's at the Reds Hall of Fame gift shop. And in Covington, Kentucky, it's at a little bookstore called Roebling Point Books and Coffee. And up here in Hamilton, it's actually at a place called Clark's Sporting Goods here in Hamilton. It's the building in downtown Hamilton that has the Joe Nuxhall mural on the side of it. So it's available in a number of places. Like I said, if you order through my website, I sign each one before I personally stick it in the envelope, seal the envelope, drive to the post office, and mail it. So, but I've had really good feedback from it. Marty loved it. Kim loved it. Jim Maloney gave me 2 thumbs up. And it just has been an amazing reaction from people to the book.
That's awesome. Well, I know I'm going to be one that's definitely excited to read it. So, John, thank you so much for taking some time and hanging out with us today.
Thank you.
We're really excited we got to promote your book, have you on, hear some great Joe Nuxoff stories. I'm really glad you gave more detail on the Macho Man story since I've always wondered about it.
Pick up the book. It's about a couple of pages in it. I think you'll enjoy it.
I will, absolutely. So for everyone tuning in, thank you so much for checking out Late Night Reds Talk Live here Monday nights, part of the Believe Podcast Network and Bet Online. Please make sure to take a moment and give us a follow on Twitter at Late Reds. Give John a follow at TV Keys, just like it shows here for his website URL. I saw that you were at College Game Day the other day for a school I don't really talk much about. That's okay though. We'll keep away from that. But everyone, enjoy your night. Have a good one, and give us 5-star reviews. Take it easy, everyone.